Hello, greetings. This is Dr. Daffern again. I'm wanting to update you on a project that I've mentioned before a couple of times in my talks. And that's the Leonardo Da Vinci Peace Prize. Now I want to explain a bit more about that, why it's important, how you can get involved, and why I think it's a really exciting and important project for this time on planet Earth. Let me explain the origin of this concept, because recently we had a study day here dedicated to Leonardo da Vinci, the great Italian Renaissance figure. He was a painter, but he was much more than that. He was a scientist, an inventor, a lover of nature, an architect, a cosmologist. He was someone fascinated by the practicalities of the real world. He invented things that actually worked, and he was way ahead of his time. He invented the beginnings of a helicopter. He invented undersea diving equipment. He invented all kinds of things. But not only that, he was also someone that was a poet. He was a musician, apparently. And he invented or designed stage dramas at Milan, at the court of the Sforza dynasty. They used to put on great performances in the evening, entertainments we call them, and Leonardo designed the costumes and the stage, the choreography. So he was a theatrical designer as well, and a philosopher. And for the last few years of his life, he was invited by Francis I, the great Renaissance king of France, to come and live in Amboise, in the Loire Valley, which is not far from here. And since we're based here in the middle of France, I thought it would be a nice thing to do to have a special day dedicated to Leonardo da Vinci's life and work. Scholars came from far and wide, and we had some excellent talks. Somebody spoke about Leonardo's work and comparing him to an American thinker who was a similar polymath. And I did a chronological historical overview of Leonardo's work in many fields. And anyway, it was filmed. You can watch the discourses on film. The next day, Geoffrey Gale, who's an architect from England who came over and gave a talk, and I went up to Amboise to see the site where Leonardo lived and died. I'd never been there before. It's been on my pilgrimage list for decades. Finally got there, and I discovered that he was given this amazing house called Clos Luce, with huge garden, by the king as his own personal domain. He lived there and worked there for the last 3 years of his life. It's now a museum, and it's amazing. It's worth going around. You can see, the bedrooms, the great living room, and the working studio that he had, where he did not only his painting, but also his mathematical drawing and all kinds of things. Like me, he kept notebooks all the time, which he filled with meticulous writing and diagrams in a mirror writing, which is extraordinary. Bill Gates owns one of those notebooks, which sold for millions. And scholars have only just now begun to really decipher and interpret these notebooks in depth. There's a new biography come out about Leonardo da Vinci by Walter Isaacson, who was an American media mogul, used to run Time magazine and so on. And he used the notebooks of Leonardo in detail to study his life and his thinking. Leonardo was a truly Renaissance mind, and I once went to an exhibition in Dublin at the Chester Beatty Museum, which is one of the great museums of the world, libraries of the world. And they had the Bill Gates manuscript, the notebook, on display, with a whole exhibition of other works from Leonardo's library. And I was amazed how many Islamic books Leonardo had. He had mathematical treatises, he had algebraic treatises, he had scientific studies of the movement of the heavenly bodies and so on, in Arabic. And he was a very learned man. It's not often realised. The other thing that's interesting about Leonardo is he never went to university. He was self-educated. His father was a notary in Florence. That means a legal, like we'd call him a solicitor or something. And his mother was just, a beautiful country girl, basically, that his father fell in love with. And they had this amazing midsummer romance, and Leonardo was a child of love. There's a professor at Oxford, Martin Kemp, has now worked out who the mother was. It's been kept quiet for centuries, nobody knew, because Leonardo was therefore born illegitimate. It meant he could never inherit his father's business or name. He was just called Leonardo from Vinci, which was the name of the little village in the hills above Florence where his mother came from. And his father had a country farm. So he was brought up in the country, and that meant that he had free access to all the delights of nature as a boy, exploring everything. And his first drawings and so on began then. Then his father decided, well, he better get a profession. But instead of having him trained as a notary, because he wouldn't be allowed to join the notary guild as an illegitimate son, even if the father wanted to. So he said, well, he might as well train as an artist. And he had him seconded to what was an artist's atelier or learning school with a famous artist in Florence. And he learned the practicalities, how to draw, how to paint, how to do shading, how to apply colour, all the technical things of learning to be an artist, which are very complicated and require a lot of skill, how to mix the paints, the colours, etc. And so that's where he trained in Florence. Anyway, to cut a long story short, he then has a reasonably successful career, although he's never very good at being an artist because he wanted to be so much more than just an artist. He was a polymath. He was always wanting to be XXX, and that's a condition I very much identify with. I'm not happy just being a philosopher or a poet or a historian. All those things are like a full-time career for most people. I want to be all those and more, So I know exactly where Leonardo is coming from. I call that the Luch complex, because Luch is the god of light in the Celtic or Druid tradition. To me, Leonardo is like a latter-day Druid. It's interesting that he came from Milan, he ended up in Milan working for the Sforzas, which was a Druid city of foundation. And long before the Romans came, it was a Celtic centre of light. And the Celts worshipped the god Luch, who's the god of light, who's a polymath, who does a bit of everything, like Apollo. And it's interesting that Luch was also the god of Lyon, which was the great Renaissance city in France at the time, which is named after Luch, the god of light. And that's where the film industry began. The Lumiere brothers invented film, which is the medium basically I'm able to talk to you on now by using light. That came from Lyon, the city of light, the city of Luch. So to me, Leonardo is like a latter-day Druid. He's a disciple of Luch, who was the sun god, the Apollo of the Celts. And that same city, Lyon, is where Claudius came from, by the way, who was the first really cosmopolitan emperor to declare that the empire would be open whatever your nationality or race. He said Celts could be a member of the Senate. You didn't have to just be pure-blooded Roman. And many of the Celts of northern Italy became Romanized. Virgil was of Celtic descent. The great poet who wrote about the underworld was actually of Druid ancestry, like myself. So if you scratch away behind the history of Italy and the history of Rome, you'll find this Celtic streak running through it. I think you'll find it in Leonardo's work. So anyway, Amboise was an amazing experience, like a revelation to me going there, seeing just the beauty of it, and communing, as it were, with the spirit of this great man. Obviously, like everyone else, I've read the conspiracy histories, the Holy Blood and the Holy Grail. I've been fascinated by this notion that Leonardo was part of a secret society, that he was the Grand Master of the Priory of Zion, whatever that was, that is claimed in the Holy Blood and Holy Grail. And I've always been fascinated by that. We also ran this year a conference on Mary Magdalene, who's the other end of that mystery. The thesis behind the Holy Blood and Holy Grail is that Mary Magdalene came to southwestern France, Aquitaine, or Occitania, and possibly gave birth to a whole dynasty, which might have ended up in being very important in French history without realising it. And that Leonardo was in on that secret. It's a fascinating hypothesis, and if you haven't read The Holy Blood and Holy Grail, you should. This is an excellent edition of it. This is a pictographic edition, and it's like a updated edition. The authors did very well. Dan Brown, of course, turned it into a novel, which was extremely successful, one of the most best-selling novels of all time. I think this is much better than the novel. Obviously, it's not fiction, it's based on historical research. I think there's something to this story. And Leonardo was certainly a man of many mysteries, as was Francis I, so was the Renaissance generally. And what was the mystery? Well, we shall find out, won't we? In a nutshell, I think the mystery was that these Renaissance people discovered that paganism, at its best, classical paganism, Hermetic paganism, the ancient wisdom, Druid paganism, and so on, all these ancient wisdoms were compatible with Christianity and with Judaism and with Islam, that the later revelatory systems, which fought for hegemony on the planet, could be reconciled and redeemed and made to live in peace by the wisdom that had been locked up in the ancients. And so the Renaissance was the rebirth of that ancient wisdom. And that's why Florence was the epicenter of it, because what they were doing in the Florentine Academy was translating the Hermetic texts from ancient Egypt into Latin and making them available to learned scholars of the day. Those texts found their way to Elizabethan England, into the hands of John Dee and the court of Queen Elizabeth I, and that gave birth to the English or British Renaissance, and Shakespeare, who was versed in this, as later scholars like Dame Frances Yates painstakingly put together and proved. So that Renaissance was a rebirth of the human spirit. It was a realisation that we don't have to be cramped into these small theologies anymore. Christianity, for all its genius and all the beauty of the church and so on, had become a theologically cramped place to be. I was talking to a friend about the theology of Dante. I mean, although it's a masterpiece and we all love it, it's a very narrow-minded kind of idea of heaven and hell. You're either in heaven or hell for all eternity. There's no possibility of redemption. You get stuck in hell in eternal damnation. And that's an extremely gloomy and I think amoral kind of theology. And unfortunately that's what Christianity had become. The same with Islam. In Orthodox traditional Islam, if you were a sinner and went to hell, that was it. You were there forever, being burned by devils. I mean, that's a very primitive and childish and immature kind of theology, but many, many people still believe that. And the same in Judaism. Although on the whole, Jewish intelligentsia were a bit more sophisticated, even though some people did believe it literally and believed the Bible was literally 100% the Word of God and that everything in it was literally true, in which case I'm afraid the pagans of the world are really not going to have a good time, because Yahweh is always out to clobber them with some kind of fire and brimstone. But intelligent Jews were questioning that at the time of the Renaissance, and in the Jewish community in Venice there was a tremendous bubbling away of ideas, also in Rome, when they went for the Renaissance as well, big time, and they realised that the Kabbalah was their ticket into the Renaissance genius. So it was an amazing time, and what was the secret that was being shared? It was that there's a more ancient wisdom that predates this bifurcation into Islam, Judaism, and Christianity. Before Abraham was, I am, said Christ. Before this split into these three religions, the Christ energy stands. And that was the insight. So people like Leonardo, Francis I, these Renaissance geniuses, Cardinal Egidio de Viterbo was probably the greatest Renaissance thinker in Rome at the time. What they realised is they stumbled into a treasure trove of divine treasures, which were there for the taking freely for all mankind. This was amazing, and it led to a renewed interest in antiquity, a renewed interest in sacred texts, and in hermeneutics, in the interpretation of sacred texts. And Leonardo was there when this was happening. His mind was on fire with that. He tried to put it into his art, but he wanted to put it into other projects as well. And the problem with the Renaissance and with Leonardo's life and work was that it was also a time of great militarism and war. It was pretty much one continual battlefield, Italy, as each separate little warring state was fighting each other. And soon France got involved and invaded Italy, and Francis I invaded, and Louis XII invaded, and so on. They're all invading each other. The English started invading. The English had 100 Years' War with the French. Militarism became the dark side of the Renaissance. And Machiavelli's Prince, which was written for Cesare Borgia, it's thought, at that same time. He knew, by the way, he met Leonardo. Leonardo met both Cesare Borgia and Machiavelli. These were dangerous times, and so Leonardo had to get a job, like so many other people. He couldn't make his life through utopian dreaming, and so he had to go and work for the military-industrial complex of the day. And he got a job with the Duke of Milan on condition that he make military equipment, inventions. And this is when he invented things like the machine gun. A lot of his ideas were for military use. He worked for Cesare Borgia as his military advisor during some of the sieges. Cesare was way ahead of his time. He thought he would unify Italy. He would go round and make all these warring states stop warring by conquering them all. It's the Napoleonic project. It's the Caesar idea. The idea that you go and conquer everybody and make them a unity. It was Alexander the Great's idea. He nearly pulled it off. Cesare was a great general, but he failed in the end and died. And Italian unification then had to wait for, 4 centuries later or something. But anyway, so Leonardo had to work in the real world, the military-industrial complex of the day, working for the Dukes of Milan, and then for even the King of France. And this, of course, is soul-destroying. It was for Leonardo, and it is for all the geniuses out there that have to go and work for the military-industrial complex. I know so many very clever people, I've met students of mine, who've had to go and get a job working for the military. Many of the great, linguists, translators, they end up working for military intelligence. Many of the great programmers and geeks that can develop computer software, they end up working for the military-industrial complex, either in Britain or America or somewhere. In Israel, in the Israeli Defense Force, there's a whole unit of young kids, graduates, who are recruited, 21 years old, and they do their military service for 1 or 2 years, simply hacking into computers in other countries and doing cyber espionage. And they're very clever geniuses, and that's what they have to do. And every country in the world is kind of doing this at the moment. Now, where's it all? Why? Why are we still 500 years after Leonardo still making our future Leonardos, our geniuses, go and work for the military-industrial complex? That's what I'm out to stop. And the Leonardo da Vinci Peace Prize is the project I've come up with to stop this. It's very visionary. It requires a bit of a leap of faith and a leap of the imagination. And I hope that you can follow me in the thought process here. What's the single biggest money spinner on the planet that is pumping out dollars in the trillions, literally, and pouring it into the military-industrial espionage complex? It's the Pentagon. It's a building in Washington, D.C. It's a 5-sided building. It's quite a few acres in size. It has a flat roof. And it has a staff of, a couple of 100,000 people who either work in the building or for surrounding projects. What they're all doing is designing weapons of war, the next generation of weapons. They're designing defensive responses to other people's weapons. And they're also designing cyber weapons, ways of hacking into computers and so on. Spin-offs are now in the cyber espionage industry, the National Security Agency and so on, all funded from the Pentagon as a huge war-making centre of operations. Now, the building itself interests me as an architectural historian. It was built in the 1940s, late 1940s, I think. And it cost a lot of money. It was the result of an architectural competition that was won by a certain firm of architects who built it. It's quite robust, it stands up quite well since then. Apart from the attacks on 9/11, when obviously a little chunk of it was knocked down, in very mysterious circumstances. I've done the research, it's very unlikely that the official plane story hitting the building actually happened. It seemed to be some other cause. I'm writing a book about that and suspend judgment on what damaged the Pentagon. That's a whole other conversation. But what is interesting is that that building is the single biggest spender on the planet, right? And we're talking trillions. The day before, or a couple of days before 9/11, the then Ministry of Defense in America announced they'd lost $21 trillion, couldn't account for its spending, by the Pentagon, which is absolutely unbelievable. Just recently, there's been a similar announcement. There's a vast amount of money gone missing in the Pentagon, like in the trillions of dollars, which cannot be accounted for. And at the moment, as I'm speaking here, in August 2018, for the first ever time in its history, the Pentagon is being audited, and it's got 2,000 accountants auditing it. Very interesting, long overdue, and if that's down to Trump, then good luck to him. It's a long time overdue that the president had the power and the courage to stand up to the might of the Pentagon. But I'm suggesting we go even further. Not only auditing the Pentagon, which is long overdue and needs to be done, finding where all this missing money is. And I think we're talking about criminal conspiracies. There are people who've been milking the Pentagon gravy train who are working on the inside. And if you look at some of the characters, it's obvious that there's a kind of a gravy train going on, a corruption. And it needs to stop, obviously. How are we going to stop it? Okay, so this is my proposal. This is the Leonardo Da Vinci Prize. It's an architectural prize. Leonardo was an architect. But he also wants that the military-industrial complex should become a peace-industrial complex. Okay, he doesn't want people to have to work for war anymore. The continent of America is named after Amerigo de Vespucci, who was an Italian in Florence, would have been a friend of Leonardo, probably met, shared chats over a table in the Florentine Academy. And I'm working on a film script on Vespucci's life. Nobody's ever made a movie about this guy, and yet he gives his name to America. He was obviously someone involved in the esoteric work of the Academy in Florence, as was Leonardo. So, but unfortunately, that kind of energy from Renaissance Italy, which has gone off and found in America, brought with it all the Renaissance Italian militarism. And America is not a peaceful power. It's got a very long history since its independence wars against Britain of launching wars either against its own people, genocidally against the American Indians who were there beforehand, and who had great peace teachers like Deganawida and Sequoyah and others. The American Indian people were immensely wise, but unfortunately, the American officialdom in Washington saw them as an encumbrance to be moved on the Trail of Tears, like the Cherokee were force-marched all the way to Oklahoma, and many of them died. So there's an internal militarism and a suppression of their own people. But then there are military escapades and adventures around the world. The USA has bombed countless countries, invaded countless countries, and has this kind of militaristic streak in it. But there's another element to the American character, which is its genuine peace-loving and its universalism. And that's the best bit of the Italian Renaissance that it's inherited. That's the Leonardo vision, if you want. I know a lot of people in America have been campaigning for a Department of Peace to balance the Pentagon. The Pentagon is the Department of War, and that's where all the money's being spent. I've always argued, since I took on the job at the University of London to create a Department of Peace Studies, to, as it were, balance the Department of War Studies at King's College, which was under Lawrence Freedman and was very successful in raising money to advise people how to fight and win wars. I've always argued we need a Department of Peace Studies in London to balance that and to think through how we can make peace. That's, I think, a more important moral question for academics to ask, both in Britain but also in America. And I've worked with peace studies experts in the States, in Europe and in Britain for many years, trying to ask them, how can we educate, how can we do research for peace? So the idea of creating a Department of Peace in Britain and in America, the USA and other countries is established. But as yet it hasn't really got anywhere. It's just a kind of idea. What I'm proposing, which is radical, is to join up the idea of a peace studies department with an architectural prize to put a top floor on the Pentagon building. The Pentagon is this, it's not actually very high, the building, and you could easily stick a second story on top of the Pentagon. The architectural company that win the prize will show how that can be done. They'll design it. And it'll be as tall as the Pentagon is. So it's, it's whatever, X meters tall at the moment. Well, the Nonagon, which would be a 9-sided building on the top of the Pentagon, would be as tall again. And the difference is the Nonagon, that's the name for a 9-sided figure, or an enneagon, I prefer Nonagon, it's simpler, would be dedicated to peacemaking, reconciliation and mediation. It'd be the official US Department of Peace. And its mission would be to prevent wars happening. The Pentagon's mission is to, well, it ought to be to prevent wars happening, but too often it seems to be selling weapons to both sides, playing them off against each other, and then intervening when you think there's some mileage in it for American kudos or American economic advantage or whatever. The Department of Peace, above the Pentagon's mission, would be carefully enunciated by Act of Congress, would be to genuinely encourage warring parties in civil wars around the world to stop fighting, to make peace. It would create a mediation service that would go out there, which would have incentives to offer both sides. So take Syria, this tragic civil war that's been going on, which I saw coming. I've tried to prevent. I've contacted the UK Foreign Office about. I wrote to the American State Department about it. Nobody can do anything. If we had an effective Department of Peace in the Nonagon, they would have sent mediators a long time ago to solve this, working with their European colleagues, Russians and so on. So that's only one aspect, but it would certainly be solving civil wars around the planet. It would also be working on the home front with questions of riots and conflicts in cities throughout the USA, even domestic violence and conflict in the home, abuse of women, the violence that goes on behind locked doors. Again, that would be part of the remit of the Department of Peace. So it'd be about transforming America's self-image from being a violent nation where you have to carry a gun for survival into a nation based on wisdom and enlightenment, which is the Jeffersonian vision of America. And I would say it was President Kennedy's vision. If Jefferson or Kennedy were alive, they would want this Nonagon to be built, obviously. So the prize is in two halves. Firstly, to a team of architects that design it physically, that it will sit on top of the Pentagon, and that the Pentagon won't need much strengthening of the roof to build it. And secondly, the team of lobbyists that get it through Congress would get half the prize, because obviously that will take a lot of doing. And Congress, if you're watching a film called The Swamp, which is interviews with contemporary congressmen, I mean, it is extraordinary what's going on in Congress, but I think there's enough people of integrity in Congress, that both in the House of Representatives and the Senate, that you could get a non-partisan bill together and get it through. And also I think whichever president was in power, Republican or Democrat, I think this project would appeal to their visionary sentiment of America as a peace nation, enough that they would sign it. I mean, Trump goes on about building a great America, make America great again. Well, if America has any claim to greatness at all, it has to be in doing things like setting up the United Nations, preventing the slaughter of World War II, finally managing to stop the Nazi madness that had overtaken Europe, and in, as a nation that avoided wars as much as possible, and as a peace nation. That's the America I love and respect. So this Nonagon would be something that a genuine president who wants to make America great again, I think, would show me where I can sign. So that's the project. Now you can say to me, well, it's too visionary. It's not going to happen. It's just utopianism. Well, that was the argument Lawrence Freedman used to use against me when I went to say, let's have a Department of Peace at London University. He said, no, there's no such thing as peace. There's only war. There's no peace. Well, I don't agree. Of course there isn't peace unless we plan for it and prepare for it and study for it and design policies to make it possible. So we need a Centre for Peace Policy Research, which is the kind of thing that the Department of Peace in the Nonagon would do. We need to bring all parties of conflicts together. We need the Interfaith Peace Treaty to be signed by millions of religious leaders throughout the Middle East and beyond. We need a resolution of the Israeli-Palestine conflict by bringing together the great thinkers and mediators from both cultures, and we need to encourage education for peace in all the countries of the Middle East and internationally, so we learn about each other's cultures and histories. I know that this kind of work would be endorsed and supported by the European Union, which encourages education for peace in its own way. So I don't think it's visionary. I think this is it's practical. This is about planetary survival. If we go on with the current rate of spending by the Pentagon, all on these weapons of war and nothing else, we're going to end up with a World War III, because that's what they're gearing up for. And as the Pentagon spends more, so the Chinese, the Russians, everybody else ups their spending. And we end up with this downward spiral of all the world's wealth is going into this ridiculous project. Whereas what I'm suggesting is a peace orientation, a complete turning about of the energy that is going into the Pentagon. Buddha said enlightenment is a turning about at the seat of consciousness, right? That's the definition of enlightenment. What I'm talking about is a turning about at the seat of planetary consciousness, and particularly in this case, consciousness in the USA, which is, as a leading nation, it's very, very important. I think people in Britain can help. We can ask politely our American friends to develop this project. We can do it ourselves by getting a Nonagon in the vicinity of the Ministry of Defence. We can pioneer a peace department. There are colleagues of mine that have long done this. I ran 30 meetings in the House of Lords, preparing the way for that. And I would love to work with people in the UK to get a Department of Peace going. We can do it in France, which is again another huge military nuclear power, which has a huge Ministry of Defence building in Paris. We need a Department of Peace there as well. So I think it's extremely practical. And in Russia likewise, and China. These are countries, Russia particularly, suffered violence, conquest by the Nazis, horrendous destruction of people. And it understands the cause and the consequences of peace versus war. I've had the privilege to travel several times to Russia, to Moscow, to Congress with Russian philosophers and savants, some of whom worked with Gorbachev when he was president. And they are genuine peace thinkers. So, my dear Russian friends, I would say get a Department of Peace going in Moscow and prove to the world your peaceful intentions. The Departments of Peace, America, Russia, China, France, etc., could then network with each other. This would be a whole different planet. What I'm talking about is transforming the planet over the next 50 years, 100 years. This is a long-term peace plan. It would take probably a decade to get this Nonagon built in Washington, but I have strong hopes. And I promise you this, that if there's enough goodwill and we get enough entries, if you email me, I'll send you the specifications.